Awesome. So it's so nice to have you here. I was hoping you could maybe start off by telling our listeners a little bit about you and your story, and a little bit about what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, I'd love to. A little trigger warning. A lot of what has led me to be involved in talking about sex really publicly is that I have gone through sexual abuse in my past. And so just for anybody who feels like it would be better for them not to listen to a story about that kind of stuff right now, I want to give you an opportunity to make sure that you're holding space for yourself. But that being said, I struggled as a kid fitting in. I never felt like a pretty little girl. I remember like that moment when you grow up and you realize that it matters the way that you look and the way that you present yourself, and that makes a difference as to if other people like you and want to be friends with you and stuff like that. And so I faced a little bit of bullying growing up. I faced a little bit of unkind behavior from boys as they discovered their sexualities before they discovered how to share them maybe more politely or safely with other people. But I was really profoundly impacted when I fell in love for the first time in high school. And I came from a really conservative background. He came from a really broken home. I was raised to believe that protecting my virginity had something to do with my moral worth as a woman. And he was taught that having sex with women had something to do with his power and masculinity as a man. And we were able to date for about a year before that really kind of came to a head. But at some point, it felt like for him, something had to give. And he sort of just ghosted me. He stopped showing up at school. He stopped answering my messages. And I knew that when I went to see him, I would end up in this kind of physical confrontation. And when that happened, it was really difficult for me. I had been trained to feel that something really important had been taken from me on a spiritual level. And I wonder if maybe it had been something that hadn't been built up that way. We could have renegotiated what our boundaries were together. But because I felt so broken by what had happened, I became even more vulnerable. And it just became easier for him to take advantage of me and easier for him to not look for my enthusiastic affirmative yes before engaging in things with my body without my permission. And so that got increasingly violent as the years went on, and before he decided that he wasn't happy in our relationship and decided to leave, I had put on weight. I had started dressing in a way that was very masculine coded. I shaved my hair. I had kind of been showing all of these really typical symptoms of women who are in these battered situations. But I had no education at that time. I at that time did not identify myself as somebody who is living through an abusive situation. It wasn't actually until he left me and I saw him fight with somebody else. I saw him get in just a very like trivial argument with another person. And suddenly, in being able to identify the mistreatment in that context with somebody else, I kind of had this whole world crash down on me, where I realized that I had allowed something that was really wrong to carry on for so many years. And so living through that, I felt that disillusionment in our relationship spread out into this disillusionment with my family structure. And as I was disillusioned with that, I became disillusioned with our political structure. And I realized that in this strange, complex, kaleidoscopic way, these few years of heartbreak that I had suffered had everything to do with the way that our society has been structured for us and the way that our parents have been taught to parent us as young children encountering sexuality for the first time. And ever since, it has been absolutely my most driving passion to start conversations so that people like me are hearing that their sexuality is a part of them that is influenced by these wider structures, and that there's this way that you need to be empowered to make decisions that aren't guided unconsciously by these kind of default downloads that we get from our culture, so that you can identify what is healthy for you in a relationship, because that's a really individual thing when it comes to our sexualities. So in being really open about that, I was approached by the steward of the stoa.ca, a Zoom event and communal podcast hosting digital campfire, headed by the steward, Peter Limberg. And he invited me to be interviewed about what an OnlyFans page that I was running at the time. And ever since, the rest is kind of history. I've been the sex columnist there, and I've been having these kinds of really raw conversations with other writers and voices that speak in this area, as well as just members of my own internet community. And it's been a really important healing and growing experience for me and a lot of other people that I've come into contact with. So thanks so much for inviting me here so I can continue that work, because it's so, so important and such a project of love for me.
Awesome. Well,
Thank you so much for sharing.
coming on.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing so openly, and your willingness to kind of put yourself out there and be vulnerable and everything too. I'm sure a lot of listeners who've had similar experiences can also appreciate that and resonate with that. So thank you. So I mean, there's a lot there. It's going to be a great show. The first question that came up for me is, as much as you're feeling feel comfortable sharing, what were some of the most important steps forward you took in your personal journey to start to promote that healing and integration and conciliation with some of those, traumatic or bad experiences that you had in the past around sexuality?
Well, I'll tell you, it definitely hasn't been linear. There's been lots of ups and downs and lots of twists and turns to my experiences since I was no longer in that relationship. In the beginning, I remember there was sort of this feeling of like spiritually sprinting away from the whole situation. I tried to maybe reclaim a part of myself that I felt I had maybe lost in the relationship by being very diligent. So I went to therapy because I thought it was the right thing to do. I saw a psychiatrist because I thought it was the right thing to do. I redoubled my dedication to my studies because I thought that was the right thing to do. And I worked really hard because I thought it was my responsibility to take care of myself given what I had been through. And I think that there was a lot of truth in that. And I can see what led me to take that approach. But in a lot of ways, what ended up happening was I just gave all of this authority that this man had over me and shifted it over to these other structures, the educational structure and the pharmaceutical and psychological structures that have existed and have been kind of normative in the mainstream view. And I found that wasn't really enough to make me feel like I got to make choices again for how I wanted to feel and how I wanted to live my life. I found that I felt kind of stifled in very much the same way that I had been stifled in the relationship, when I felt like I had to perform, like, this is what it looks like to be a good patient. This is what it looks like to be a good therapy client. This is what it looks like to be a good law student. And I was still trying to tiptoe and fit into molds for a long time. It wasn't until I got really frustrated with the lack of results from trying to fit into the box of, properly recovering PTSD victim or something like that, that I started to have this outpouring of self-expression where I just started to really tell anybody who would listen what had happened to me, in private DMs on Twitter or in conversations on the bus, with reopening the discussion with my family. All of it was really important in that it was about finding out how I really felt about what I had been through. And it's hard. It's really difficult. And I think it's difficult for anybody to look at their sources of sexual shame, frankly, like that, and sit in those feelings rather than always running away or trying to solve them or trying to present them in a way that some authority would be able to accept. And since then, my recovery has become much more self-directed and collaborative rather than fitting into these top-down social structures that are presented to us as the correct place to go when you have some sort of serious issues come up in your personal life.
So for these strategies, do you feel that having them be self-directed and collaborative is actually a solution that could be more constructive, more remediating, more healing for our culture? And are there manifestations of that? Like, are you working towards that, let's say, in your studies and your practice? Do you see our culture moving to a healthier relationship with sexual remediation and healing and therapy in those directions?
I really hope that I'm a part of moving things in that direction. I think hosting these kind of raw conversations over Zoom events and stuff like that, it creates a space where you don't have to be somebody special to hold space for someone else's self-exploration around these really heavy and really emotionally charged topics. I feel like there's a lot of gatekeeping and problems that happen when we say that sexual trauma is something that you have to kind of put in this little corner and only professionals can help you through that, and only certain people can talk about what that's like and what that does to a person. I think it's really nice to let it just be part of our lives the way that it naturally is. Sexuality isn't this part of ourselves that we can compartmentalize as much as I think culture tries to tell us that we can. And so just bringing those conversations out in the open with regular people who have been through their own stories is what I see as the guiding light for bringing these kinds of conversations outside of such a clinical pharmaceutical kind of context.
Maybe you mentioned the structures, and when I first started looking into the subject of the pleasure of politics, I was really curious of the intersection between someone's own personal experience, personal bodies, personal pleasure, and how that can go to sort of the macrocosm of politics in general. So I was curious on how you sort of see the two intersecting.
This is a space that I think is really interesting to talk about. I've been researching for an upcoming interview at the STOA with Kim Tallbear on settler sexualities on November 6th about the way that the main structures that influence what we consider sexually normative and sexually deviant are the church, the state, and science. And I think that in these discussions, I often find that people know about the church. Everybody knows that sexual shame comes from the church, and that's something that gets brought up right away. But I found, especially studying religious studies in the context of my university experience, I discovered that there's a lot of parallels between the church and the state, and that often we make a lot of really broad sweeping arguments that religion is the source of a lot of our social problems, without considering that actually the secular context does just as much to entrench and perpetuate those norms around sexual repression. I find that there's pardon me, there is a sort of Protestant work ethic that is snuck into our secular society in the forms of, hustle culture and those sorts of things. And this idea that having fun is maybe a lazy thing to value or something like that, or that play is something that's a disruption to somebody's learning rather than the path to learning, is as much a secular point of confusion as a religious point of confusion around the role of pleasure in our lives and our well-being. And then science, I feel, is very much at the service of both of these institutions. Science is very much influenced by what is normative in our spiritual beliefs and our political beliefs. And I think that science has given us less of what it has to offer in the realm of sexuality, because there's such a taboo coming from these two other places in society that says, oh, we'd actually rather that the scientists study something else that doesn't make us quite so uncomfortable. I remember reading that when the Kinsey reports first came out, it was the first time that people in general found out that oral sex was like a normal thing. And I just find that mind blowing. Like, I can't imagine how it must have felt to find out that that you're not the only person who likes to put other people's genitals in your mouth. I can't imagine having done that in my personal life and not knowing that that's something that everybody engages in for the most part as part of their sexual practice, and that everybody was kind of harboring this, shared secret of, this is what I do in my bedroom. It gives me just such a sense of kind of like joy at the innocence of the way that these intersections misguide us and misdirect us from sharing our true experiences with one another. I think it's just it's too bad, but it's also it's humbling. It helps me remember that there are these kind of like outer realms of what we feel is relevant, and they put pressure all the way to the center of our lives. And there's such a kind of spaciousness when you understand that that's always happening, and that's always something that you can discover something new about.
Yeah, this is really interesting. And it kind of relates to a lot of my thinking and rumination around issues of like race and so forth. But just the idea that there are all of these structures and systems and contexts in place that really shape and mold so much of our lives and interior experiences, how we relate to subjects like sexuality, right? And you had mentioned the church as being a very explicit player in shaping, and I guess, like, some suppressed views or negative ways of relating to sexuality. But the state or science or other institutions are more subtle. They're kind of invisible, and we don't really necessarily know the degree to which they impact us unless we have a specific frame or lens of introspecting on ourselves that can really excavate these invisible structures that we've internalized unknowingly, right? We don't know the water we're swimming in because we're so drenched in it. And so that's kind of one of my why I like to talk about how the individual intersects with societal forces, because coming from a purely spiritual, Buddhist contemplative meditative background, the kind of introspection we do on ourselves was solely personal, solely phenomenological, right? I feel a sensation in my left toe, I'm feeling some emotions coming up for me, I'm having some thoughts, but there's not necessarily a meta contextual awareness of what were the larger societal forces and structures that shaped those experiences to begin with, right? They're invisible. So I guess my question is, as we're becoming more aware of how these forces have knowingly or unknowingly influenced us, do you have a particular style or method of introspecting on them so that we can light up and illuminate these invisible structures that we've unconsciously internalized?
I do have some kind of guiding areas. I don't have a system that I've nailed down for myself. I'm still exploring a really vast arena of different psychotechnologies that can be useful in these sorts of explorations. But I'm definitely very influenced by Mating in Captivity by Esther Perel, as well as Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski, and Existential Kink by Carolyn Elliott, I would say, are the three kind of guiding frameworks for me right now. Mating in Captivity focuses on the idea that you need distance as well as closeness in order for there to be an erotic spark in a relationship. It talks a lot about the way that we can enjoy long-term relationships and get out of this hookup culture that I think a lot of people are stuck in right now with dating apps and stuff like that. We're so addicted to that, 3-month honeymoon period, and once it's gone, we don't really know how to sexually relate to each other as a couple that's trying to build something that more like a companionship than just a fling. And I found that in order to follow the advice about creating these erotic tensions in your relationship, I had to learn a lot more about how erotic tension even happens in my body. And I found that Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski was really helpful for that. It's the concept that I feel most influenced by in her work is the dual control system of sexuality. And she uses the metaphor of a gas pedal and a brake pedal that are fighting for control over your sexual experience. There's a lot of things that turn us on, but when they're competing with things that are simultaneously turning us off, we're not experiencing the sexual pleasure that we could be fully. And then finally, Existential Kink takes it to that spiritual depth. It talks about, okay, if I'm not having the sexual satisfaction that I would like to see in my relationship, what spiritually might be the barrier to me expanding in that direction? And it allows you to do a little bit of the shadow work around the shame that might be holding you back in sexuality. In that work, she says that shame is the magic killer. You want to be able to transform yourself, but shame says no, that wouldn't be okay. And you really need to sit with that feeling, and you really need to have a dialogue and a conversation with it, and become friends with it before it feels satiated and safe and is willing to allow you to move on to want and desire more deeply.
Would you want to unpack a little bit of what you mean by, or what Carolyn means by, existential kink?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, existential kink is the idea that there's something sensual about just being. There's something that is spiritually at stake in enjoying whatever right now looks like. And it's a really radical reconsideration of how our experiences land with us, because her kind of guiding tenet is that having is evidence of wanting. So you start from the place of imagining that everything you've had so far in your life, you've had because it's what you've wanted from the deepest place in yourself. Maybe there's this little voice that says, I should do this, or I'd like it if I was more like that. But that part of you represents such a tiny fraction of the place where desire comes from in your experience. And so these much more powerful, unconscious desires often tend to outweigh the little voice in our head that says should. And her idea is that maybe we can embrace that. Maybe we can go to a place where we accept ourselves fully and find out, why would I have wanted the parts of my life that in my narrative I talk about as things that were terrible, were traumatic, were things that define me in a way that I wish I could resist more. Because I think that there's a lot of power in understanding what kept you small, and what kept you from expanding and demanding from life what you really could be. It's one of those things like, it is our light, not our darkness, that most terrifies us. The shadow work is really important, because once you dive into the darkness, you have the courage to let your light forward.
Yeah, one of my sort of, researching sort of prior to this show and looking at everything, came across a lot of stuff. One of them sort of is the context of sort of this heteromasculine society that we live in. Also, one of my favorite quotes is sort of, I was reading this article by Audre Lorde about the uses of the erotic, and talked about women empowered and are dangerous. And so I was just hoping maybe you could share a little bit about the voice of, sort of from your perspective, and especially in like, these communities that we're in, where we're trying to make sense of the world, of how can people in general embracing their own desires, eroticism, make them more empowered.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Audre Lorde that a woman who is empowered is dangerous. I think that an individual who is empowered is dangerous, and I think that that's why there are so many forces that come down from all of these different societal structures that keep us docile. I think that one of the biggest one of my biggest strategies for empowering myself is just educating myself about the ways that I have been miseducated and disempowered. I think that there's something very freeing about reclaiming authority you didn't realize that you self-imposed in the guise of a societal structure, because we have all of our power in ourselves. And ultimately, something like the government is an intersubjective reality. You have to agree to it. You have to buy into it for it to have authority over you. You have to believe that it has some sort of wisdom that you don't have. And when you realize that it's actually your wisdom that empowers the government and not the other way around, you can unhook a little bit from maybe these tug of wars that we see in politics all the time, and reclaim some of that attentional space for your own inner exploration and for your relationships, for your conversations. I think that another thing that's really important is asking yourself where you feel like you owe something to someone. There's I think what like the easiest one that comes to mind for me is that we all believe we need to be working a 9-to-5 job or something like that. At the very least, you should be working 40 hours a week, or you're not contributing to society, whatever that means. And I think that when you open up just a statement like that, I have to have a job, you find out what it is about yourself that gives power away. And you don't necessarily have to be able to reclaim it in that moment. Just noticing that that's the sort of dynamic that you're existing in right now opens up the space for something new to emerge.
Yeah, I want to ask your opinion, and this is something I love talking to women about because I always get such a wide range of responses. But I think you're sharing at the beginning about some of your experiences with your former partner that were not positive, right? And I think you were saying something like as men, right? We and women, but I guess for this question, as men, we tend to internalize certain norms or ways of operating in regards to something like sexuality or gender relations, and they may not be positive, but we're unconsciously acting them out as some kind of script, right? Those predilections and impulses are not infused with our own personal consciousness or individuated form of awareness. We're just running a societal script, and I have debates with people about are certain, what is socially constructed, so to speak, what is more of an innate biological or universal or even spiritual drive, and how are those things entangled with each other? And so, I mean, how should I phrase this? What kind of like advice or guidance do you have for men who are kind of grappling with their own sexuality? How do I relate to women in a positive or healthy or wholesome way, while also integrating some of the more, I don't know what you would call it, Dionysian kind of impulses, right? And the kind of shadow in that area, and how do we integrate or even work with those forces that we've internalized that have become entangled with our own biological and even like spiritual or ego, personal psychological drives that we have internally?
That's a really awesome question, and I'm glad that you asked, because I really care about reaching out to people who are struggling with this area of their lives. I think what feels alive for me to share on that right now is something that I have been working on myself in this and other areas of my life, and that's just working on over identification. I found that I just recently did a kind of self-compassion audit of myself. And for me, that's where I struggle most, is I over identify with my struggle. When I'm feeling like, oh, I'm the kind of person that no one's interested in going on a date with. Oh, so sad. I believe that that's something that's really unique to me. I don't think about, oh, this is something that's a struggle that everybody goes through at some point in their lives. And I don't think about, this is something that I can grow through, that is not permanent about me. It's not who I am. It's just what I'm experiencing in this moment. And so I find that when I speak to men who are really frustrated about their experiences in the dating world and the sexual world, I often find that they feel that it reflects an enormous amount about who they are as individuals. And that just breaks my heart to see, because women are just human beings, men are just human beings. We can make graphs about, there's like normal distribution curves or something like that, but all of us are just looking for the same kind of belonging and love and acceptance in the world. And there's so much less that's at stake in how your first date goes, when it comes to your worth as a man and as a person, then you're told by the society. I think a lot of us grew up watching TV and rom-coms and getting this idea that romance is some sort of make or break part of your life that defines whether or not you're really good enough as a person. And I really appreciate John Vervaeke's thoughts on this in his Awakening from the Meaning Crisis YouTube lecture series, where he reflects on the way that the overemphasis on romance has narrowed what we understand love to be, and disconnected us from our humanity in some really important ways. So if I were a man struggling with the dating world today, I would hope that I might have the courage to really do some self-discovery around what love feels like to me in and out of sexual contexts. What does my body feel like to me in and out of sexual contexts? And what do women feel like to me if I'm a straight man? What is it that feels so different and other about women and femininity? And see if maybe you can't maybe like neutralize it just a little bit. You still want that distance, you still want that erotic fire, as Esther Perel would teach us, but you can see the humanity in people across the gender spectrum, and realize that we're all just struggling for the same things, and we're all struggling to find our own sense of identity. And you can connect and relate to people in this struggle, even as you struggle for their approval, which I think it's a really delicious tension that you can bring into your conversations.
So when it comes to sexuality online, I think this is an interesting topic because there's a lot of ways in which social media both enhances and amplifies identity and exploration of identity, but also creates tensions in situations where, well, I'm thinking of like Twitch streams and this whole relationship, which is not very even between, let's say, a female personality and then the hundreds of followers, and the kind of expectant attitude that, let's say, I don't know, well, trolls might have, the DMing, the harassment. So how can we kind of navigate, first of all, like, what is your take on these sorts of spaces, and then how do we navigate maybe towards a healthier relationship, something that is much more reflective of that great answer you just gave in terms of humanizing and empathizing with the person on the other side of the screen?
Yeah, I think in this pandemic context, more than ever, we really need to have a literacy around parasocial relationships and an understanding of the fact that there are a lot of these kinds of relationships that happen online that aren't as direct a one-to-one sort of ratio of human connection than what you would get if you were sitting in the room and talking with another person. I think that it's something that I have more experience thinking about from the personality side of things. Like, how do I put myself out there as a parasocial presence in a responsible way that manages the expectations of my audience and reminds them that I am a human being, but that they're only interacting with an aspect of that humanity in this context. It's on the edge of my thinking. I think it's on the edge of the thinking of a lot of people who are hosting Zoom events like this. It's new for all of us to be seeking so much connection in a virtual realm, and having to make do without the sort of one-on-one attention or non-verbal communication that we would get to enjoy in other contexts. I think that one really important thing is that you can break through that parasocial wall. You can create a true social connection that starts from these parasocial places. And I think the more that we do that, the healthier these dynamics are going to be, both for people who are, I guess you could say, performers maybe of that parasocial connection, and consumers. I guess it's a term that makes me a little bit uncomfortable, but we are consumers of content when we're engaging in parasocial relationships, and we are consumers of content when we curate the influences that we take in online. And so I think if you can reach out to the people that you're in a parasocial relationship with and try to start a real social conversation and invite them to have an actual one-on-one dialogue with you, that's really powerful. I think that it's something that I'd like to do more in my conversations with the Stoa. I think I've been moving in the direction of hosting these raw conversations more often than hosting a guest and presenting them to a group of people, because I think it facilitates more of these direct, honest, open, communicative situations rather than things being broadcasted and consumed and having that kind of divide in the roles of the people who are engaging in a parasocial kind of context. Did that answer your question? I hope it did.
Definitely. Thank you. Yeah.
Awesome.
Great answer.
Maybe so. I had a question. I was reading, I think it was Come As You Are, and it was talking a little bit about, and I think I've seen this more too in other places, that younger generations, maybe 20s, whatever, are doing more flings and hookups, less sort of committed relationships. I was seeing if you kind of have a take on that, and also your take on hedonism. So I think some of maybe the criticism of this might be, well, that, people are just going to go out and chase every pleasure and just kind of get trapped into sort of that corner. So sort of if you had a sort of a take on sort of the mix of those two questions.
Yeah, I think what's alive for me there is this idea of, like, 50 years ago we had way more friends and way less stuff. And that's something that has been affecting us in all sorts of different areas of our lives. And I think that it really hits home when it comes to trying to maintain romantic relationships, whether you're looking to have a lifelong monogamous situation or just looking to have your relationships last longer than a few months. It's something that I think we've sort of lost a cultural skill for. And it is an area of curiosity to me, what factors into why that would happen. I do think that there is so much instant gratification, and there's so much attention, like, oh, sorry, I don't know, I flashed out of the screen, so I'm not sure. Can you guys
You're
hear
good.
me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay,
You're
sorry
good.
about that. That knocked me off of my train of thought for a moment there. Give me a moment to recollect my thoughts.
No worries. Take your
Right,
time.
right. Okay, so yeah, I think that there's a way that there's so many different ways that we can get instant gratification. There's so many different ways that our attention can be dragged in all of these different directions really quickly, with the way that social media is set up and the way that our lives are just at an ever faster pace. And I think that there's this space where you need to slow down and open up to yourself in order to realize what your values are. And that's something that doesn't happen often enough, and I think it leads people to sell themselves short. I think that when you don't know what you value, you don't know that you value connection as highly as you do. And so you're willing to settle for these short-lived relationships that give you a little bit of validation, but not really a lasting foundation for mutual growth between two people. And I think that when you don't know what your values are, you also don't know the kind of person that you would want to have a longer term relationship with. I think that if you don't know yourself well, it's easy to bounce between different people playing this kind of socially scripted game of seeking approval. But to move past that the first few months of that honeymoon phase, and where you're having fun with somebody playing this game that's been scripted out for you, you need to know who you are and where you're going with your life and what you want to build, or at least be interested in finding out about those things about yourself. And I don't know, I really, I hesitate to tell people that it's important to be in a long-term relationship in a romantic context. I think that sometimes we're living in a situation that's so couple-centric, and to to fault hookup culture because it doesn't result in lasting couples seems a little bit status quo to me. Like, oh, you should be getting married and having babies or something like that. And I don't really feel that way. But I do think that what startles me more about it is that it's not just that we're not having lasting relationships with our romantic partners, we're not having lasting friendships, we're not having lasting kinship relationships with our family, we're less connected in general to our extended family than we used to be. And it's just like the support system for the individual is being whittled away so much, from my point of view, at least. And so I think that what I would encourage people to do more so than examine their barriers to being in a long-term romantic relationship is to examine their barriers to having deep, lasting connections in general, whether it's in the context of family or friendship or intimacy. I think that we're getting this really hyper individualized message that we're supposed to just do it all alone, and I sense so much loneliness everywhere around me. And it's not just because we have to stay home and we can't go to the bar anymore. It's something that started way before and is going to kind of exist longer than the lockdown situation if it's not something that we can all collectively take a look at and reprioritize. Because I think we used to know that this was a really important part of life, that community was a really important part of life. And that's something that in the narcissism of social media culture, we're drifting away from. And I'm ready to like send out the life rafts and go back and get it.
Great answer. Yeah, this is something that I think as a motif or a theme has really kind of come to the forefront of our conversations on this show, in the sense that so many of the thinkers we've been speaking with and scholars and researchers are all kind of talking about this missing social dimension, right? This desire for, and speaking of desire, this desire for connection with other human beings, sexual, romantic, or otherwise. So my first question was going to be, how do we learn about what we desire, right? I was just watching this fantastic lecture by Mark Fisher back from like 2010, like as Occupy was taking off, and he was like making this metaphor about Starbucks. And Fisher had this great way of turning something very kind of left-brained in the sense of like political analytic and really kind of showing the humanness behind it. So he's like, well, Starbucks is really expressing this desire to communicate and be in a third space with people, right? We don't have these public spaces anymore. So we all go to Starbucks to fulfill that or to satiate that, not just for the lattes, right? And in some ways, I think, particularly this year, we've had so much disconnect just materially, physically, but it's really highlighted how the internet maybe, it is not it is like the Starbucks in the sense that it is expressing a desire for connection, but its prosthetic expression is not satiating or fulfilling, as you're saying, like after the pandemic's over and we're able to hook up in bars again or whatever, just be social in cities, et cetera, again, that dimension is not necessarily going to be fulfilled. So maybe we can gear this conversation a little bit towards the aspirational and ask you, what does a healthier society expressing its desire look like, or what would you like it to look like, culturally speaking?
I feel like what feels most alive for me in this area is play. I'm so inspired by improv by Keith Johnston. I've done clown training, which is just like very, very intensive play therapy. And I think that there is just this enormous power to play that ignites our imagination and teaches us that we are so much more than our regular set of identifications about ourselves. So I think that there's maybe the most important thing is to start befriending failure. I think that we're presenting ourselves and maintaining our images so much more all the time with social media accounts and all of that sort of thing. And failure, it adds these stakes that take us out of this proximal zone where we're really learning and exploring and opening ourselves to ourselves and to other people. I remember when I was in clown school, we learned to juggle, and the first thing that we did was to just get really comfortable throwing the balls on the ground. Like make failing the first step, make failing a part of what success looks like in whatever situations that you walk into in life. So yeah, I don't know. I think it would be really funny if we started like speed dating where you like deliberately try to be as awkward as possible, or we start playing games with each other where we say the worst thing we can possibly think of, the thing that is the least allowed to be said in a moment. Start really examining what's out of bounds, and questioning why it would be so bad if somebody might see me that way, or think this about me, or see me in this kind of moment or in that kind of position. It's funny. I realized I did makeup for this for the first time in pandemic history. And it's like, even I am always presenting myself and trying to have an image. And there's so much room for me to grow in my sense of play and my sense of embracing failure as a part of success. And I love to call myself out in little moments when those thoughts come to mind and say, it's like, oh, there is a way that I could have failed here and it would have been fine. It would have been fine for me to show up here with no makeup. And it's fun to celebrate this idea of like, I don't have to come so close to perfection all of the time. There is a realm of good enough that is expansive beyond what I believe is good enough. And to start really yeah, sitting on the edges, dancing with the boundaries, getting a taste for what it's like to take yourself a little bit less seriously and worry a little bit less about the way that you're read by other people. It really opens up this space where you can start getting connected with the level of self-acceptance that you need to do really deep shadow work, like what is advocated for in Existential Kink and other methodologies.
Yeah, just a comment that it's always so fascinating and fun for me in these conversations is that a lot of what you're saying is really a kind of universal path of wisdom and transcendence, where the gateway into the conversation may be sexuality or sensuality or relating, but the end result is a kind of like transcendental universal wisdom in general, right? This identification, knowing what your values are, getting more self-awareness, sense of play, relaxing the ego, right? So it's like, even though the starting point is something very specific, the end result kind of transcends the particular subject and has a universal spillover effect into the rest of our lives, which is really inspiring to hear. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on more mainstream sexually oriented movements or subcultures. And I know like the whole 50 Shades of Grey thing, where like BDSM or kink or movements that were formerly highly stigmatized are now becoming more mainstream or more acceptable. I mean, that is pretty much like the norm here in Portland, Oregon. Like, I would be a weirdo for not doing that, right? so like, do you have thoughts and any criticisms or critiques of these movements, and how do you personally think of them in terms of how you relate to them yourself personally?
Yeah, I'm definitely involved in lots of, kink communities, the polyamorous community, queer community. There's all sorts of areas that used to be viewed as like so deviant and so taboo, and now it's sort of like a personality, as somebody would maybe say on Twitter or something like that. And I think that is my main critique of all of these kind of subcultural sexual practices, is that they can become identitarian in a way that is confining. So using dom sub dynamics as an example, if you're a dominant person in a certain sexual situation, that's really exciting, and there's so much to be uncovered about yourself in that scenario. But I would worry that once you step into that role, you might overly identify with that role, and you might mistakenly believe that there's nothing you could enjoy about taking the submissive role in a sexual situation. And I'm really inspired by Leslie Rogers and the Light Dark Institute. I had a conversation with him earlier on the Stoa as well, and he spoke about being a dom in his partnership, and yet finding that with another partner he was able to explore a side of himself that felt much more submissive and much more feminine, and that he was really lucky to be in a situation where he was with people who were comfortable enough with practicing different sexual explorations that they didn't stick him in kind of like the dom category and preclude him from exploring a different side of himself in their relationship, because it was just a very beautiful, gratifying, lusty experience for him to get in touch with a side of himself that he didn't know he had. And so I feel that way around polyamory and monogamy too. I think that too often we present ourselves like, I am a monogamous person and I am a polyamorous person or something like that. And I really respect some of what Daniel Schmachtenberger shared recently in his discussions at the Stoa about reclaiming some self-sovereignty from these relationship structures and being able to say, you know, I'm not a celibate person, I'm not a monogamous person, I'm not a polyamorous person, I'm a person and I love and I have relationships and I move through these different ways of structuring those relationships in ways that is beneficial to me and to the people that I love. And so that's my main critique is explore everything and don't choose anything as like a name for yourself. Don't name your sexuality. Don't become like, this is the kind of sexuality that I have, because I wouldn't want you to lose your moreness in that special area of your life. There's so much eroticism in how vast and mysterious what might arouse you is. And I hope that everybody can leave all of their doors open, even as they go through doors that they've never gone through before.
Yeah, that's very interesting. A lot of stuff comes up for me. I think, you know, when I grew up Catholic, and sort of implicitly sort of taught to not, you know, that desire was sort of a bad thing. And it wasn't until I started sort of reclaiming my own spirituality where I had to examine maybe that side of myself to go, okay, well, how can I still be enlightened and still embrace these sides of me that I think I've been taught that should be outside of me and that I should reject. And it wasn't until I started learning more about Tantra and some of Deepak Chopra's work where I started to say yes to desire and started to follow that. And so I guess I'm curious on, as you get more subtle and you go into sort of sexual energy, looking at the dynamic, at least for me when I was kind of growing up and stuff, or about how do you also, and I know also looking at this research of looking at the dynamics of eroticism versus pornography, and then also negotiate what, you know, that side of when you are embracing a relationship that I think it was in the Made in that Captivity book that sort of talked about that, you know, an equal in the bedroom equitable relationship is not exactly the most fantastic to have. You want to have some polarity, and that dom submissive role kind of creates that energy. It just sort of how would you encourage younger people to have those conversations as a sex columnist?
Could you maybe clarify a bit about what are you hoping people can learn more about?
Yeah. Yeah. So like if you're, you know, let's just say you're in the 20s and you find another partner attractive. And, you know, maybe you've been raised to be chivalrous, respectful of the other person, but you also kind of want to eventually have that dynamic of where you're going more subtle in the sense of, okay, now we have to explore the dynamics of maybe what really turns on the other person. Is it just enough to sort of create that space where you can have that conversation, and also to make sure you're practicing healthy sexual conversations and not creating sort of the foundation for a possible abusive relationship?
Right. Thank you so much for clarifying, because I think this really it speaks to my own experience. I think that I'm really learning right now on the edge of what my own relationship practices look like, that honesty is the hottest thing that you have to offer. And it's also the most like foolproof way of ensuring safety. I find that I've been in relationships even just in the past year or so where I really like, oh, I saw somebody and I was like, oh, they're so cute. Let me think about what I think they would like and see how close I can come to presenting myself that way so that they like me back and they want to get in the bedroom with me. And I've paid for those choices in so many ways. But the main rub of that for me was that when those relationships didn't work out, it felt like I didn't work hard enough. Like I didn't fit the mold well enough. And that was such a painful experience. And so in my practices now, I've been really focused on just saying, hey, this is what I'm like. And I think this is what you're like. And I think I like that. And I think we can go somewhere with it. And then if somebody is not interested, it feels like they're not interested in the real me. And bizarrely, that's way more comfortable than finding out that somebody doesn't like the act that I put on, especially for them, hoping that they would like me. There is something about being myself and having somebody be like, thanks, but no thanks. That just feels like, okay, I put myself out there, but I was 100% me and I didn't try to manipulate anybody. And we both got what we ultimately needed out of that situation. All of our boundaries were out there and all of our boundaries were respected. And if you're not honest about who you are and what you're looking for, that's something that you miss out on. And so it's totally, I mean, it's so funny because values are hard. Honesty is my number one value in a relationship, and it's my number one value in life. And it is so hard to live up to. So when I say that people should just be honest with people about wanting to date them, I know that that's way easier for me to say than for people to do. It's terrifying to go up to somebody and just be like, wow, this part of you, it just lights me up and I can't get enough of it. And if you would give me more, I would be so happy and I would love to explore what I could have to offer for you in your life in return. That's a really difficult thing to do. And it's really difficult to face rejection. And it's really difficult even to decide how you're going to present yourself in the way that's the most honest for you. Because there is a balance between being honest and being sensitive, and that's something that I don't know that I can put words to. There's just a big difference between being like, I don't know, I guess it's like as a parasocial figure, I often get like some very honest comments that are not sensitive, like take off your clothes. Like that's honest. They want me to take off my clothes, but there is a sensitivity in how you bring your honesty forth in a relationship, and that's just something that you have to work on with skill. When somebody presents the same desire but is able to say, you seem like somebody who really likes to show off their body because you have a lot of pride in the way that you look, and I just wanted to come and let you say that I appreciate that and I agree that you look awesome and I think that you're doing a great job sharing what's valuable to you. That's the same thing. That's the same thing saying, I like your body. I want to see your body. I like it when you let me see your body, but saying it in a way that celebrates me as a human being rather than just kind of dumping your desire on my lap. I wish I could tell you how to do that 100% of the time, but I don't do it 100% of the time. Sometimes I just dump my desire on somebody's lap and I'm like, oops, sorry, that was a faux pas. And it's just something that you need to have as a value and do your best to live up to every day, and know that you're not always going to be perfect, but keep striving to know yourself well, to present yourself with honesty but also sensitivity, and to know that if that doesn't always work out, at least you're being your most authentic self that you can be. And I just have to present it as axiomatic. I promise you that it feels better to get rejected for who you are than accepted for who you aren't.
I had a totally unrelated question, unless Jeremy and Ryan, you got something.
Go ahead.
What I know recently, I've heard a lot about sex workers unionizing, and I was just curious if you had any thoughts on that you could share with our listeners.
I don't know about any like unionizing that's going on. It's not something that's been in my space. I haven't been working on OnlyFans or doing sex work recently. But I do feel that sex work is something that's valid. It's something that's a job like any other job. And there are so many ways in my experiences as somebody who did sex work that there's just unnecessary hurdles that you have to go through, unnecessary injustices that you have to face as somebody who's chosen to make a living that way. And so I really hope that that women do find that there are ways to organize and take collective action to empower them to shift the discourse around sex work and have it seen as a a profession like any other profession, a service like any other service. I recently interviewed Chester Brown at the STOA, and he wrote an amazing graphic novel called Paying for It. I actually have it right here. And it is about his monogamous relationship with a sex worker, and his understanding of that as just as spiritual and intimate as any other kind of sexual relationship. And also that his view is that in the future, sex work won't even be something that's confined to a professional sort of dynamic. He says that there will be just relationships where you have sex for money and relationships where you have sex for free, and that'll just be the way that people make choices about how to structure their relationships. And I find that really appealing. I like the idea that 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 making a living can become a more natural part of our experience of living. It doesn't have to be this like work-life balance. We can start to see that work is part of life and that it's infused in what we do, and that we can seek support for the things that we are passionate about. And if one of those passions is like sharing intimacy with people that you don't necessarily want to have a romantic relationship with, money could be a part of that. And I hope that all of the barriers to just making consenting adult decisions about sex and money will hopefully fade away as we get to hear the voices of women who have made their living this way, and listen to them directly rather than listening to what paternalistic voices concerned about prostitution might have to say about their experiences. So yeah, that's my 2 cents. Thanks for, I really like unrelated questions. I think that the non sequiturs are fun and fresh.
Yeah. So, in terms of my own personal politics, maybe if I said this publicly, it would permanently ruin any of my chances of running for office. But I'm basically like a radical libertarian on social issues. So in terms of like prostitution, sex work, drugs, I'm like legalize all of that. This is my personal opinion. But if I want to put my Fox News grandpa hat on for the moment, there are a lot of like criticisms from the conservative perspective on how that could like morally damage, like Jimmy Carter went off in like the 70s about how, this is teaching like young men to like think of women as objects or whatever, So like, I guess my question to you would be, what would be your best attempt at steel manning that kind of conservative perspective? Like, do you have any legitimate concerns about the kind of mainstream normalization of sex work in doing some, I don't know, moral damage to society if not done well? And then what would be your like counter response to that? If that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that the normalization of sex work could also definitely be just another part of the hypersexualization of our society, and I do agree that that would lead to just more of the same kind of problems that we already have, with just less hassle for this particular interest group that has to deal with those issues the way that we all do. I think that there's a way that when I hope that sex work can be normalized, what I hope beyond that, the interest beyond that position, is that sex itself would become more normalized. And that doesn't mean trivializing sexuality or commodifying sexuality or objectifying women as providers of sexuality in some sort of perverse way. And I can see why from a conservative background, you might have a lot more of those concerns, and they would be foregrounded in your mind in the way that they're not maybe foregrounded in my mind. I definitely think that there's also there's a way that because we're starting from a point where there is so much sexual shame that making sex really available to a bunch of people who are traumatized around their own relationship to their own sexuality can just put everybody in kind of this situation where they're bombarded by the idea that sex is supposed to feel normal and natural and exciting all the time, and it won't land that way for people who have grown up in situations where sex wasn't initially presented to them as a fun, explorative, playful part of their lives. And I think that there 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 is a really difficult nuance around this kind of issue of collective consent. Um, it's one thing when you have to pay for your OnlyFans account to see the pictures of the women and stuff like that, but there's this way that broadly sex is shoved kind of in people's faces all the time. If you're the kind of person who was choosing to explore celibacy at this time for whatever particular reasons were relevant to you, it might be really difficult for you that there's porn ads on every website, and that there's, you know, sexual quotas, it seems like, that TV programming tries to hit, and there's this way that there needs to be a conversation about the culture before the culture can shift in a way that's going to be empowering for everybody. And there's absolutely concerns that just taking off the reins and letting people run wild without helping them to reconnect with the parts of themselves that they have had to shove away because of the culture that they were raised in could really confuse everyone and lead to misunderstandings that result in a lot of hurt. And I hope that we can all be conscious and mindful of the opportunities that come from whatever cultural changes come, and try to take things slow and allow things to be personal. I think that the speed that we go at in cultural change sometimes right now, it gets away from us. And I resonate with anybody who's like, I'm overwhelmed with the way that sexual culture is changing. I need to slow down. I need to go back to first principles. I need help understanding why this shouldn't fill me with guilt or shame or disgust, because those are really difficult feelings to sit with. And I don't think that it's compassionate for people on the left to be like, well, I'm going to dress like head to toe in latex and walk my partner around like a dog at the grocery store, and you just have to deal with it, Nancy Reagan or something like that. I think that this is a cultural movement, and it should benefit the collective. It shouldn't just be about taking a certain subculture and elevating them above anybody else.
Wonderful. I had kind of a long passage I would sort of like to just read to our listeners and also to you to see if you have any feedback on it. It's from the book Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good, written and gathered by Adrienne Marie Brown. And she states, pleasure activism is the work we do to reclaim our whole, happy, and satisfiable selves from the impacts, delusions, and limitations of oppression and or supremacy. Pleasure activism asserts that we all need and deserve pleasure, and that our social structures must reflect this. In this moment, we must prioritize the pleasure of those most impacted by oppression. Pleasure activism includes work and life lived in the realms of satisfaction, joy, and erotic aliveness that bring about social and political change. Pleasure activism is us unlearning to make justice and liberation the most pleasurable experiences we can have on this planet. I was seeing if you had any reflections upon that.
I feel like it ties in so well to what we've just been discussing. I think pleasure activism is a great way to talk about how this needs to be a broader movement than just liberation of, say, sex workers or something like that. Everybody does need an education, a re-education about the benefits of pleasure and the the way that pleasure can be part of our political identities. And I find it really interesting that she says that the pleasure of those who have been oppressed needs to be put first. And I totally agree with that. And yet, because I was just wearing my Fox News grandpa hat with Ryan, I feel like it's really alive for me to speak to a way that I imagine that could be misread by a lot of people as what I had said earlier, like the idea that these people who have been most oppressed need to be elevated above us and given sort of like a special treatment, which I know that the Fox News grandpa just would be loath to see some group given special treatment while the rest of us like affirm that they are allowed to be different in that new elevated way. But I find that there's this way that when we oppress as a society a certain group, that has an effect on us. So in prioritizing the people who are oppressed, it's not that we are taking them separate from the rest of us and focusing on their pleasure first. It's a really important first step in healing, because as oppressed people, they put us in the role of oppressor, and until they're liberated, we are not free either. We are trapped in that role as the white or the supremacy or the dominant culture, and it is every bit as much about the liberation of people in those other group identities as it is about the group identities who have suffered the most. So there's this way for me that solving oppression is in fact actually the next step for the people who are privileged in order to see their own empowerment in the world, because there's like a serotonin cycle to being an abuser that gets translated into being a privileged person in a more abstract way. When you look at the alpha gorilla in the gorilla tribe, they actually have like a neurological need for these acts of submission to be continually presented to them in order for them to feel safe and normal in their little gorilla tribe. And I feel like privileged people suffer from a very similar thing. We don't really see it this way because it's such a default experience, but we do need to constantly be given these signals that our race or our gender or our what have you is part of the default culture that is correct and right and normative in society. And that's like sort of like an addiction. It's a need that's overlaying our more genuine needs as humans that shields us from who we really are. And so by taking your privilege and checking it, you actually get to find out who you are without it, and see people the way that you would see them if you'd never thought that somebody could be better or worse because of the color of their skin or whatever sort of biological makeup they might have or gender they might present as. And that's a tremendously freeing, pleasurable experience. So I think it's I get concerned from like taking off my Fox News grandpa hat and wondering, oh no, what if my extreme leftist hat person wouldn't like me spinning that oh we have to like take care of the oppressed first, but it's really about the privileged people. That's not really what I want to say either. What I mean to say is that this can be a collective project that is absolutely for the freedom of the hearts of everybody. And I do think that the places that there is the most oppression are the places where there is the most possibility and potential for everyone to see themselves in a very different way. And that can be very expansive, and it can be it can create a kind of equality that doesn't need to show up in the unsexy way that's not fun in the bedroom, like Esther Perel says. It's like we can all be human again, and we can all express our humanity in a really individual way. And I think that that's really exciting, and that these group identities can stop becoming a barrier to our own individual expression, because I think that that's too often what they really amount to.
Yeah, great answer. It reminds me of Anna Louise Keating's concept of post-oppositional politics, right? Like actually involving the oppressor in the dynamics of transformation is so important. And I think it's also in the spirit of a regenerative-oriented left in terms of you can't just go, okay, we're going to cancel out the oppressor. They're going to be deleted from the conversation. Like there's work to do in this relationship. There's a dynamic that needs to be untangled or at least transformed. And so I appreciate you really emphasizing that, the mutuality of this relationship between oppressed and oppressor and the entanglement of desire and addiction or needing that empowerment, right? So there's so much to explore here and unpack. I wanted to mention an interesting kind of case study that maybe we can unpack. Somebody was mentioning, I'll pop the comment up because we've got a couple more minutes and I'd like to take a couple of our questions. Let's see, here it is. So somebody was asking about, let me see if I can make it show up here. Yeah,
cool.
I kind of can. In Toronto, Canada, a sex doll brothel attempted to open high-end sex dolls instead of actual women. The public outcry caused the place to close before opening, and then they continued by talking about that the opposition to it was from all sides, conservative, progressive. So I think they're kind of asking, Hunter was asking really about like what is with that? Like, why is it coming from all sides? It's not just the Fox News hat guy. It's also perhaps the Democratic, centrist, etc. guy as well. And so I'll just add the caveat here to this question about like, how do we unpack this and understand it? It seems to speak to what you're saying earlier about really needing to help steer the culture and really do a deep cultural re-education about sexuality, right? Because this goes beyond one end of the political spectrum or the other, but I'll let you unpack it.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting because as soon as I see it, as soon as I see public outcry, I'm like, oh yeah, that's public. Like there's not anybody I can think of who would have no emotional charge around the idea of this kind of a change being introduced into our society. So I think that what's interesting is to think of the way that maybe this moves towards the technological like coup of our lives. There is this way that I think a lot of us are looking out at all of these global problems like, oh, there's this hookup culture and oh, climate change is coming and oh, but the computers will save us. And I think that this is a really good case study of like, okay, this is what happens when we tell the computers that they're our only hope. And then we introduce them into these most intimate areas of our lives and find out that, oh, actually, we have no idea how to handle the digitization of what used to be uniquely human to us. And I think that that's what makes it so broadly uncomfortable for people from all sorts of different walks of life is it's like, oh, sex is something that, it used to be something that maybe was only allowed to happen between a man and a woman who were trying to procreate for God or something like that. But at the very least, maybe all of us are still in a place where we kind of do feel like sex should be between human beings. And there's something that's scary about the idea that the robots can take that job from us. That's like a job that we kind of want to keep for ourselves. But I'm definitely curious what you guys have as the foreground thing that comes up for you on this, because like you've mentioned, there are so many different angles from which this could be uncomfortable for people.
Let me just ask Jeremy, partly jokingly. Jeremy, would you be pro sex doll because that would be the beginning of a post-human world?
I think the reaction against the non-human element of this, right? The uncanniness of this. There's a repulsion here. There's a sexual repulsion, right? It's a taboo or something. There's a threshold that was obviously struck and crossed. Now, I think that might change, and there's different like levels of engagement, like in terms of, okay, well, a sex doll physically is too much, or it's too repulsive by our culture, it's too much of a taboo. But then, I don't know, some kind of virtual reality game or porn itself, which is mostly like, if it's not live, it's a digital experience, it's a virtual kind of experience, that's okay. So I don't know, I don't have a straightforward answer for you, but it seems like the avataric embodiment of something non-human to engage with sexually seems to be a bridge too far for our culture. And in terms of the non-human and sexuality, I don't know. I think again, sensuality and desire and communion with the non-human world, which may blend and blur into sexuality in interesting ways, is a different aspect than a sex doll, right? But I don't know. I don't really know how to unpack it. I'm not very well versed in it, or if it would be, because it is coming towards the human, right? Like there's an appearance or a guise of being human-like. This is also like the question that was explored in shows like Westworld on HBO, right? Like these are non-human, but also possibly human in terms of the story, but they're also like ways for us to express violence and desire, both, right? So it's an interesting question, right? What happens when they do appear human enough to get satisfaction out of violence and or sexual gratification? I think it's a tricky territory to be in to navigate. So I have no answers here. I don't know. How about everybody?
How
I mean,
liberal
this
is Toronto?
Sorry?
How liberal is Toronto?
That's a good question.
I would assume to be, as a major metropolitan city, that's very multicultural and diverse. I would assume to be pretty liberal.
Yeah, I would think other cities, like I'm thinking like I would think like San Francisco or New York probably already had that like 5 years ago or something, but I actually don't know. I don't know why Toronto would be up in arms about it. Maybe with COVID, it's a little different situation.
Possibly.
I mean, my take on this is that, and one of the reasons why I actually do care a lot about the moral commons of the community or of society, right? I have a lot of interest in like Michael Sandel's communitarian philosophy and experiencing kind of gray area moral issues that definitely trigger our moral intuitions, but we're not really sure about how to rationalize them. And the reason why I definitely lean libertarian on social issues is because of this kind of status quo bias that we all have, where what was considered, I mean, just look at the gay marriage thing, right? Like that was a huge issue back in 2008. Obama, Hillary, Biden were like, no way. And then 7 years later, it's like, oh, never mind. And now, like, not even the most conservative people are really spending their time attacking that. They kind of conceded that, we've moved towards being accepting of gay marriage, and now it's not really an issue anymore. So, I'm because of how easily our opinions on these things change. I'm like, well, I kind of agree with Sam Harris's take, especially with the more controversial child sex doll, which has a whole pedophilia kind of thing. It's like, if we legalize that, open these brothels, and the studies show that maybe like violent, like rape or sexual violence or pedophilia decreases, then we should be for that, right? Because it's an outlet. And so very pragmatically speaking, if the violence is not being done to human beings, then why not just take it out on a doll, right? I mean, I hate talking like that because it's just so like cold and calculating and rational, but I don't know. I can't, as much as I do have a reaction like, I don't feel really okay with that, I can't rationalize enough to be against it. You know what I mean? So ergo, I'm okay with sex doll brothels.
That's right. On the record. You're on the record, Ryan.
On the record.
There goes your political future.
Oh man, I knew this podcast episode was going to ruin me.
No, I think it's interesting because there's like a way in which what makes it okay for you is that it's fake. And I think for a lot of people, that's what makes it not so okay. Like, I saw a lot when I had an OnlyFans page that there was a broad kind of view out there that there's something about paying for an OnlyFans subscription that's like fake, and men who pay for an OnlyFans subscription should be ashamed that they would be willing to settle for fake sex or fake attention from somebody that they have to subscribe to in order to have an interaction with. And I think that comes up here too. There's this way that there's some sort of way that maybe we feel as people who are having sex with human beings that there's an authenticity that gets watered down if we decide that you can just pay for it from a sex doll, especially because I mean it's a little bit of a performance when I engage with somebody as part of an OnlyFans agreement where they've subscribed to my content and subscribed for access to messages from me. But there's a way that at least there's some way that you can still go wrong. I can be offended and decide not to engage with somebody anymore, even if they have subscribed to my OnlyFans. Whereas a sex doll isn't going to have any capacity to be offended or to enforce our normal moral codes on a person who's expressing their sexuality. It's an area where people are not going to have to work for their sexual gratification or obey any of our norms in order to get that gratification. And so the fakeness, it does create this arena where things that we wouldn't allow to happen to real people could be allowed to happen. And that, I think, is at the crux of where there's all this emotional charge around it.
Yeah. Just a few comments from folks saying Hunter is following up about Toronto having this history of Puritanism, and that there was a time when people went to Buffalo, New York to have fun 50 or 60 years ago. There's still a stiff old money British banking vibe. Interesting. You know what's funny, just like culturally speaking, you know, we're streaming to Twitch, and I've recently been connecting with the Twitch Lefty Streamer Network, so some of them might be tuning in or listening later. And I found a lot of them tend to be from the Toronto area, just like in Toronto or around Toronto. And a lot of them are very involved in American politics as well. So it's kind of an interesting, this is kind of a side note, but I kind of wonder if there are some sort of like generational tensions with an emerging, very digital savvy, progressive, cosmopolitan sort of culture online, and then physically or materially, you know, Toronto still has this kind of history there. You know, Jordan Peterson, I think, is from Toronto. The Stoa is from Toronto, right? In the Toronto area in terms of Limburg, Peter Limburg. So interesting kind of things that are coming out of Toronto, I just have to say. Of course, McLuhan as well, classically speaking. So it's an interesting space. So where should we, like, we got only a couple more minutes, so where can...
Yeah, we can't end on the sex doll thing, right?
Yeah, why don't we, like...
How about racism? Racism?
Oh, no. Where could we first of all, what's up for you next, maybe on the Stoa, in terms of who you're talking with next, what's going on next, and where can people follow you and connect with your material?
So I am a Twitter personality. I go by Maybe Gray there. So you can get into a direct conversation with me there, break through that parasocial wall. I would love to see that. I am also going to be at the Stoa tomorrow, hosting Carolyn Elliott, the author of Existential Kink. So if you'd like to learn more about that very spicy take on shadow work, you can RSVP to that event at thestoa.ca. November 6th is my interview there with Kim Tallbear on settler sexuality, and that will explore especially the intersection between politics and desire in Canada through the lens of the Indigenous perspective. And I think that will be really exciting. Kim Tallbear is just an absolutely amazing intellect and an amazing woman. And I think that she's doing some really important work. And so I'm just feel very blessed that we'll be having her there. And then just more raw conversations all the time. Watch that space because this is my life really is about having these kind of open, vulnerable conversations. That's the experiment that I'm embarking on right now, and I'd love for anybody who's interested to be a part of that with me.
Great. Great. Thank you so
Awesome.
much, Maybe. I posted those links in the chat across all of our streams, so definitely follow Maybe on Twitter and try to tune in tomorrow. I'll be trying to do the same thing. Maybe you're doing awesome work, and we hope to follow up with you in the near future.
Thanks so much, everybody. This has been a blast.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you, Maybe.
Maybe.